welcome, welcome back, or welcome if this is your first time. It is my distinct honor to welcome our next speaker, Dr. Carl Stauffer. Is this on? Are we having an issue? I think we're good? Okay, thank you. It's my distinct honor to welcome our next speaker, Dr. Carl Stauffer. Dr. Stauffer is a senior expert on reconciliation for the United States Institute of Peace. He has 30 years of experience both as a practitioner and academic in restorative justice and peace building. Before joining USIP, or the United States Institute of Peace, Carl was an associate professor at the Center for Justice and Peace Building at Eastern Mennonite University. He also directed the Co-Scholars Program in Switzerland and co-directed the Zaire Institute of Restorative Justice. Previously, Carl served 16 years in South Africa, holding positions of Regional Peace Advisor for the South Africa region, Program Director for the African Peacebuilding Institute, and Education and Training Coordinator for the Letsema Conflict Transformation Program. He has worked in 37 countries and has done consulting and training work with the United Nations Development Program, USAID, World Vision, ICRC, as well as with government ministries in Jamaica, Trinidad, and South Africa. If that weren't enough, Carl's transitional justice experience includes work on peace accords, community police forums, truth and reconciliation commissions, collective trauma recovery, reparations, memorialization, among other areas. So without further ado, please welcome my good friend and esteemed colleague, Carl Stauffer.
Thank you, Michael. That was more than you needed to harvest off of the net. My apologies for that introduction. Senior expert too means just that I'm balder. I think that's how I understand that title. So it's really a pleasure to be here, and such a pleasure to follow my two esteemed colleagues and or four esteemed colleagues, the two this morning too, in this work, and also the third time back to UVU, and so it's really great to be here with you. And I just want to say a few introductory comments, and then we're going to jump into one case study that I've been particularly immersed in, and that is in Colombia and the transitional justice process in Colombia. Before we jump to that, my wife and I have this discipline. Each year we spend time in sort of quiet reflection, devotional work, and prayer, and fasting, and sort of seeking what is the spirit sense for the year. And this year, the words were very clear to me. It was, you are to be an architect of hope. An architect of hope. And I've been in this field since 1991, and I often get students asking me, like, how do you stay sane? How do you keep doing this work? And my simple answer is, my faith is really, really important in this work. Spirituality has been really, really important part of that. I don't know if I'd be in this field without my sense of faith. But the other part of it is, having seen so many incredible women and men doing this work all over the world, in ways that they're unsung heroes. They're never given a spotlight on. They don't make the news. They're not on CNN. And they're not, in fact, I wish they were. It would help us all. And so part of this architect of hope is to tell those stories. When folks say, hey, you were doing peace building in Africa for 16 years, how did that work? Doesn't look like it's done a whole lot. Well, maybe it hasn't, but I can tell you this, all across the continent in the 20 different countries I traveled in, there are incredible folks putting their life on the line every day in regions and provinces, in local communities, doing this peace work. And without them, things would really implode. Last April, I was able to last August, able to travel to Colombia and take in, or August, it was the trip before that, it was April, able to take in the hearing, one of the public hearings, one of the many public hearings of the Special Jurisdiction for Peace in Colombia. And I want to start with, I'm going to weave that story throughout the presentation. I'm going to start with my first impressions. I got my teeth cut on transitional justice stuff with the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, so I had a lot of that in my head when I entered this public hearing, which was in an area called Joppa, and I'll refer to that a few more times. But in this photo, all of these men in the white shirts are former military who committed extrajudicial killings. Is this on? Because if I don't need to lean over and shout in it, I won't.
You're good. It's a little light, but...
Okay. Great. So these are all former military who committed extrajudicial killings, what was called false positives. And let me give a little bit of a trauma trigger here. I'm not going to try to traumatize you on that, but this is the military machinery, and especially when we declared the war on drugs. What we decided militarily, that's the US with the Colombian government, was that the success would be determined by body count. What that means is the more dead bodies, the more successful you are in the war on drugs. What that means on the ground for those in the battlefield theater, if there's not enough FARC, that was the dissident group that they were fighting, to find and kill, then how are they going to get enough bodies to show that they're winning the war? And that's where the malicious, horrific imaginations of violence come in. And so what they began to do is kill innocent people. Went to marginal folks, youth, homeless, folks who were living on the streets or maybe had other disabilities, and actually killed them and took their bodies then as a body count in this war. They were called false positives, and about 6,000 to 7,000 lives were taken in that manner and protected by the military system. And in fact, not only protected, rewarded by medals, sent off for training in other countries, sending their families for elaborate holidays. So these men were caught up in that system. And a particularly large number were killed in this particular area, Joppa. Now, you might be saying, I thought you said you were an architect of hope. I just didn't help you there. That was not a story of hope. The story of hope now starts sitting in this auditorium. As I enter, I'm first of all astounded by the fact that I see these men sitting here, and across the stage, you can't see them, but there's a few here, are the victims' surviving families and communities. So they're literally on the stage together. I was not used to this. South Africa, we had victims hearings, we had amnesty hearings, but they were separate. And yes, I was involved in trying to bring them together. That was one of the things we as civil society were offering the Truth Commission in South Africa, because they were requesting to meet. Amnesty applicants wanted to meet with families or communities where they had committed their political violence. But I was not prepared for this drama on the stage that was going to unfold in the next few days. And there was folks who were helping with the victims and their families and their emotional needs. There was folks who had been trained in trauma healing and trauma-informed work, working with each of these men who were going to be, and all of them were going to have a chance to tell their stories publicly. The national cameras were rolling. Around the auditorium were the faces, the shots of all the men who had been killed in banners with their names. So it was naming each and every life that was taken. On the front of the stage, there was various forms of colorful pottery done by victim survivors and victim survivor groups. Some of the pottery was distinctly broken or cracked, and there was messages painted on about how the war had completely destroyed or brought tremendous trauma to these communities. In the audience were many, many victims groups, many of them dressed in indigenous attire, because this is part of an area where they have indigenous communities, and others from what's called the Afro-Colombian communities, where most of the fighting happened were in these indigenous and Afro-Colombian communities. They have experienced the lion's share of the violence. The hope came in many different ways, and I'll share a number of those stories, but the one I want to share here because of the photo is to sit and listen, and there was 24 defendants, each one of them, to stand before the victims and survivors and apologize unconditionally for killing their loved one. And then saying they did not deserve to die that way. I destroyed your family, I destroyed the communities. And then they went on to explain the system, not to justify the system, but to explain how the system in that military reward system was working and how it shielded and protected them and how they got caught in it. And there we saw unconditional apology, people taking responsibility for gross human rights violations, and also acknowledging the structure that enabled this. Rarely do we get all of those together in one space. Rarely do we get unconditional apologies. We often get, well, that was war, we were young, we were commanded. Rarely do we get folks explaining how the structure was set up to multiply this violence. And I sat there, that was last April, thinking about our own country and how difficult it is to sit in the same room across the political divides for the hatred and the anger and the violence that we're throwing at each other online. And there's so much bad news all around the world. We're in a situation where conflicts are erupting all around the world. I don't need to remind you of that. And people said, where's the good news? And I said, here, let me tell you about these 24 men who got up and did this incredible thing, where I saw the resilience and the best of the human spirit, able to take responsibility. So much of our conflict is about not taking responsibility. Our conflicts all over the world, big or small, war or just neighbor disputes, it's because we don't want to take responsibility. And we don't want to say, how can we repair? How can we help you rebuild? So I've entitled this presentation, Finding Justice Amidst the Rubble. I've used that before because the work that I'm involved in is messy. There's no other way to talk about it. And this case study is going to be complicated and messy. So while I'm telling those stories of hope, there's also many other stories of challenge, and we'll get to those. But what I want to say is this. Colombia, for those of you who are not aware, has embarked on a peace process, on a transitional justice process since 2016, when they came to an agreement with the FARC, which was the primary armed dissident group that was fighting the government. There are others, but this one, they came to this agreement, and they have been pioneering new work. And how have they been pioneering it? What they decided to do, up until this point, transitional justice has had a love-hate relationship with restorative justice. Some have said restorative justice is great, they bring it in on the side, they practice a little bit, they let the civil society do it, and they say, yeah, we're doing it. Desmond Tutu, Archbishop Desmond Tutu used restorative justice, and I knew he read it and he studied it, but he used it freely. I'm not sure that we in South Africa knew exactly what it was. And Colombia has said we can bring restorative justice in. We're also going to bring it into our ordinary criminal legal system and see if we can do them together and stay within the human rights and the humanitarian law boundaries and see if we can't find a different path for healing as a country. So in order for us to understand that, we need to do what all of us peace builders do and go back to a little bit of conflict analysis. For those of you who don't know, Colombia was under war up until 2016 for 52 years, one of the longest running civil wars in the world at that time, second to Sudan. You had insurgent militias, you had guerrillas, you had narco-parliamentary groups and government forces. You had 8.3 million victims that have been registered, 7.3 million displaced people, almost 1 million homicides, killings, and more than 160,000 disappeared and other victims of kidnapping, war-related sexual violence, torture, and child soldiering. This was complicated, as violence always is, and very difficult. It went through 3 generations of Colombians. Some of them were fighters in each of those generations, from the grandparents to the parents and to the children. These 52 years of war and peace have a very long timeline, and I'm not going to take you into all the detail of this, except to say that FARC, the resistance movement, started in 1964. The first attempt at peace talks with them was in 1984, 20 years later. The talks broke down because of paramilitary work that had exploded to try to fight the war on drugs, but at the same time also ran as a mafia, took land and offered security for payment, and if you didn't agree to that, you were also under possible violent threat. So 1996, FARC began to take hostages and to kidnap in order to get ransom money in order to keep the struggle going. And that opened up a whole nother set of harms that are being dealt with now. There was finally in 2000 an attempt again to deal with the narcotics. This was between the US and the military in Colombia. But once again, that was broken when FARC kidnapped a presidential candidate and held her in captivity for 6 years. By 2011 and 2012, the FARC lost multiple of their top leadership to conventional warfare. And by 2012, President Santos came into power, who has led the way into the peace talks that occurred in 2016. It was a comprehensive peace agreement reached and signed by all parties. On June 23rd, they agreed to a ceasefire and a disarmament, and on August 24th, a final peace agreement was agreed to. And as one of my former colleagues said, and now the peace process begins. So there's some theoretical issues with bringing restorative justice and the ordinary criminal legal system together. And I'm not going to spend the time going into all of those, but the ordinary criminal justice system, probably the best way to describe that without being disrespectful, is that it is configured around punishment. The idea is that punishment will deter some from committing the crime again. Punishment will be hard and painful enough that others will not repeat the harm that they're doing. And punishment, especially through incapacitation, to keep us as society secure, so imprisoning people. One of my mentors and a founder in the restorative justice field, Howard Zare, often talked about it this way. He said, the ordinary criminal legal system basically says who's to blame and how do we administer pain, with the hope that it'll change the crime, it'll change the harms, etc. Restorative justice simply doesn't buy that as the only avenue in which to go. Restorative justice says, and there are reams of research that back up both of these ideas, but restorative justice says people change their behavior for many other reasons other than just punishment. And there are other ways, non-violently, and other ways of accountability that can be put into place to deal with the justice needs that don't need to involve state-sanctioned punishment. And so there's a lot of questions, and here's some of our funny language that we talk about it, but it's really, if you want to talk about paradigm clash between our ordinary legal system, our Western legal system, and the restorative justice system, you're looking at a moral normative. Restorative justice says there's a moral issue here that needs to be repaired, and it's normative. We need people. Restorative justice says we have no restorative justice if no one takes responsibility. So one of the first things that Colombia said in their restorative justice thing is, if you want to take the restorative justice track, you have to agree and acknowledge your role in the harm. You have to take responsibility. And then you have to tell the truth of what you did. And then you have to be ready to receive what they call restorative sanctions, which involve multiple ways of which you're being held accountable that may not involve prison. And I'll get to some of those specifics in just a moment. But what we're dealing with in transitional justice, which relies on human rights, trials, and the punitive law, the International Criminal Court, etc., is a kind of sort of agnostic, meaning they don't really have strong moral feelings about this. It's more of an agnostic political approach to sort of reconciliation. So the questions that we're dealing with when Colombia, and what makes Colombia so controversial, is what satisfies victims' needs for justice in a context of mass violence. Do they need to see trials? Do they need to see the people who harmed them stuck away in prison for the rest of their life, or even death for death, life for life? Or do they need to see the behavior change and see people who possibly did horrendous things to their communities and to their families change their behavior and offer to repair or bring restitution or reparations and rebuild the communities and the country that they destroyed? What does justice mean? What does punishment mean? What does accountability mean? What does healing mean? What really changes our behavior? How do we prevent this reoccurrence? One of the things that transitional justice claims, we have 4 pillars. The one is truth-telling, the second is justice, and that needs to be defined. It's often defined again by a legal system. And then what is reparations? How do we repair? And how do we make sure we prevent non-reoccurrence of the same violence coming back? So the context of the Colombian peace process is that peace agreements, just the global context, and this is where we need architects of hope. Since World War II, we have more global conflicts than we've ever had. Okay? And we had less global conflicts in the 1990s and the 2000s. That was the golden age of peace building. We were doing peace agreements all over the place. We had professional peace mediators going in, and they were doing their thing and closing up their briefcases and going. But what we've discovered in longitudinal research is that almost every one of those peace agreements has crumbled within about 5 years. Why? We don't know exactly. I have my ideas, some other people have their ideas, but let me say we think it's a number of things. Number one is you can be technically brilliant in mediation, diplomacy, and you can do everything to the letter, but if it's a technical agreement, it's not going to hold. Because violence is ultimately relational. And unless we can figure out what are we going to do with all the relationships that have been broken and destroyed through this harm in a country, that peace process is not going to stick. And many, many of our diplomats, who I admire greatly, do not have the facilitation skills that we were talking about here. They're not trained in them, they don't understand them. In fact, I've read whole books where they've analyzed the president and the commander of the resistance militia and how they brought them together and how they manipulated them and how they understood their psychology and their personality and all of this. I've read books that were 192 pages of that. It's very intriguing, but they don't say anything about civil society, about grassroots communities. What do they think? This one book I read, I realized I'd closed the book and he had said nothing about the civil society. And this was a book entitled The Last Best Chance for Peace in Angola. I'll leave that. It was just, there's a gap there. And so the reason I believe in restorative justice is it complements transitional justice to help us move down into all sectors of society to try to begin to understand how do we make peace. So, and as I already mentioned, Colombia had a 52-year war. It's very complex, both horizontal and vertical, many armed groups, and layers of generational victim survivors and perpetrators. The civilian population, who we know are the most affected by the war, in the last 100 years, 70% of all casualties are civilian in our wars across the world. Unarmed, ununiformed, men, women, and children. So let's be clear on who's most affected by these wars. And so you have tremendous fatigue after a 52-year civil war. in the civilian population, among the citizenry, as well as the government structures. The peace agreement was brokered by a trusted regional set of allies, including Cuba being the main negotiator. And while that might make us unhappy, and we wish U.S. was in there, U.S. was not the person to be there. They were not the trusted, legitimate ally for this particular situation. The FARC had carried a communist socialist ideological agenda, and they needed someone they could trust in this process. And much of what my colleague said just before me, Ray, and others came to power in this situation. But ultimately, as in many cases, the peace agreement was a political compromise. It was a kind of political forgiveness or reconciliation, and but it didn't involve the different parties abandoning their ideologies. They were to abandon their violence, but not necessarily their ideologies. And this becomes another source of tension as we go. The components of the agreement were very, very noble. There were 6 of them that were built out. The one was a need for rural development policy. The FARC came into power. They took up arms to fight because they had a grievance around land issues, and all of the issues that involve the stealing of land that often comes from a small, rich urban elite that runs these political processes, and that was the case in Colombia. Ending the conflict was very clear. There was going to be a ceasefire everyone had to agree to, and then a disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration process of all of the armed actors. Third, political participation by the FARC. The FARC demanded that they be respected as a legitimate political party and be able to register and have seats in parliament depending on the vote that they got. Fourth, there was an attempt to talk about how do we deal with the illegal drug trafficking. Of course, that's still a big problem. But one of the more creative things that came out of this peace agreement is what they call substitutional crops. And so the government's working very hard on providing substitutional crops to the regular drug crops and trying to see if they can build a new economic base at that level in the rural areas. Fifth was to meet victim survivor needs, and sixth was to make sure that there was ways that they could verify the implementation of all of these processes. In the photo over here, just if you want to know more about Colombia, this is just a presentation by one of the staff from the Truth Commission. They have taken the report of the Truth Commission and they've digitized it in a very creative way, where you can go online onto a dashboard and look for as whatever information you want to from thousands and thousands of pages of reports, as well as videos, photos, and other artifacts from the Truth Commission process. The components of the agreement set out for 3 key structures. I should have said HEP is one of those structures, not structures of the HEP, but 3 key structures of the transitional justice process. The first was a Truth Commission that has finished its process. It had a 3-year mandate. Incredible report that has come out that really established the history of this violence. It's a very sophisticated report. It's a truth-telling process done excellently. And if you have a chance to look into that, I strongly encourage you to do that. The commission was led by a Catholic priest also, and they did a lot of hearings and public hearings, so folks really began to hear the story. The second structural piece is they have a search unit for the missing and disappeared persons, and that has a 20-year mandate. I want you to understand how pioneering that is. South Africa had a 2-year Truth and Reconciliation Commission mandate, finished. So Colombia is finally acknowledging what we've all been saying, and that is when you rebuild after 50 years of war, it's going to take a few decades. Let's put the same resources, the same time that we put into violence. And so 20-year mandate to find those, as much of the disappeared and missing persons, and also return any remains to family. And of course, DNA testing and other technology is helping with this considerably, and they're making progress, slow but incremental progress on that. And then there was the special jurisdiction for peace. And this was the container to hold both the ordinary legal system and restorative justice together. And that structure has a 15-year mandate. And I was privileged to be able to interact with the magistrates in my first visit to Columbia to talk about restorative justice, and then later on to run a certificate course for their staff and advisors. The structure of the HEP is there are 38 magistrates, judges, that have been chosen. They each have a staff, a group of staff, a team of staffers and advisors. They have a president who has term limits. The current president is Roberto Vidal, but he's about ready to end his term. And there's an executive office that tries to do all the administrative side and programming side of the process. The process has been victim-centered, again, for a long time. Even before the peace process, the government of Santos agreed in 2011 to start taking victim statements, and they set up victim centers nationally who began to take the statements, and why they're able now to register 8 million of a country of 48 million who were directly affected by the war. There are 7,000 registered perpetrators, or those who caused the violence, and again, they were given this choice, which is what makes this a new pilot, really, in transitional justice. If they chose the normal route, they could go through a trial, a hearing. It would have to be proven that they were guilty, and they could face up to 20 years in prison. If they chose restorative justice as a pathway, they had to take full responsibility, do truth-telling, and there was a considerably reduced sentence and a restorative sanction, which I'll talk about in just a bit. Oh, let me go back here. This is an amazingly inspiring nun who was at the Jopal, and her brother or nephew, I can't remember which, was killed as one of these false positives. And she spoke with tremendous courage and tremendous strength. And behind her, you can see the photos of the disappeared. And it was a very moving moment. What the HEP has to work with is what they call macro cases. So they have 11 macro cases, which are, what they mean by macro is they're not going to be trying individuals. They're looking at the conflict, the violence was so complex that their job is to look at macro cases. What that means is various kinds of cases where they have to look at, was there a pattern, was there a system of violence being perpetrated here? And so they're looking at the illicit detention and kidnapping of people, extrajudicial killings by the army, recruitment of child soldiers by the armed groups, war-related sexual and gender-based violence, particular victimization of the armed forces in a particular group in a certain area, and then quite a number of the cases are looking at territorial locations, locations where the violence was particularly intense and involves a whole range of gross human rights violations, but they're taking them territory by territory in the hearings. So what we see here is, again, this is another view of the HEP hearing that I was at. You see one of the former Army officials at the podium speaking to the victims group. By the way, the victims groups were not only given a chance to tell their story, so they went back and forth. There was a story from the victim survivors and then a story from a perpetrator, not necessarily the same, but from the same area. But at the same time, every time one of these former Army or military officials was speaking, the family was invited to intervene at any time. They could raise their hand and say, wait a minute, that's not what you told me before. And by the way they're centering the victims is they're not only consulting with the victims, they bring the victims and the perpetrators together for restorative hearings multiple times before there's ever a public hearing. So they're not meeting each other for the first time on the stage. They've had some conversation. They know what the stories are going to be. Very challenging work, but incredibly powerful. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the restorative sanctions here and then give a few stories of the experience. So the restorative sanctions is another pioneering aspect of this. So with each macro case, the magistrates are going to be coming up with a set of restorative sanctions. These are a minimum of 5 years to a maximum of 8 years. So it's a maximum of 8 years. Those 5 to 8 years could include partial incapacitation, like having a prison sentence, but it's not to be the dominant set of years. So you can't have 7 years in prison, 1 year with restorative sanctions. You need to balance that a little bit. It might be 2 years if you think that's really important if the person is a danger to self or others. So they can entail restrictions on rights to be free in the sense of movement and speech. So they're not saying they're completely restriction of rights. There are clear restrictions of rights that may be involved in these sanctions. Why these two areas? Free speech is the fear that the use of social media to politicize and to continue the violence, so that might need to be restricted. And the movement, because if they require them to go and do reparations in a particular community, they'll be expected to stay there for the duration of that time, whether that's their home community or not. So those are things that they will not have choice in. The direct connections to repair and rebuilding in the country are extremely creative and very unusual also. They're again looking at how do we rebuild after the war. One of the key things is there was a great deal of mining, landmines laid across during this 52-year war. Many of the restorative sanctions involve these former offenders taking a leading role in helping to demine the country. There is also involvement with infrastructure construction, rebuilding schools, community centers, places of religious affiliation, bridges, roads, etc. There is memorialization projects, and this picture here is not just a pretty picture. This is in fact a architect's design of a memorial park that they're planning to build in Jopal while I was where this hearing. And when we went there, it's just a grass plot in the middle of the city. And we understand that the significance of this plot is that was a shallow grave for quite a number of the ones who were killed during the time. And so they've exhumed all the body remains and reunited them with family, but they're going to build a memorial on top of that, and they're going to ask the former fighters to help rebuild this memorial. It's a fantastic memorial that not only has, as you can see, a lot of green, and they want to have 200 different kinds of trees. They have a fountain in the middle. They have a open air amphitheater, as well as a closed museum and meeting space, and then there's some recreational space. It's directly across from a high school, and then a residential area on the other sides. The mayor of Jopal and their office is deeply involved, and they're getting funding from the UNDP for this project. So a few stories, powerful stories. I'm hoping these will bring some hope. At one point during this public hearing, one of the former military stood up, and I believe he was at the level of lieutenant. We had all ranks, including even a general, which is also very unusual. This lieutenant began to talk about not necessarily that he was directly involved, but he commanded those who killed. But he was also directly involved in some. And as he made his confession and spoke about what had happened, all those things I mentioned before, he then started to do something that wasn't necessarily planned, and that was he began to read the names of every person that was killed under his command. He not only read the name, but then he said, and this person was innocent, and this person did not deserve to die, and this person was not a member of any of the armed movements. And as he began to rehearse this, it was almost like a liturgy. There was pages of these. And at first we thought he was going to do one or two. The victim's surviving family connected to this case said, keep saying their names out loud. And so he began to read with that proviso after everyone. It became almost like a sacred liturgy. And it was almost a moment in which the victims had been saying, you disgraced our families, because they had to spread rumors about the ones they killed, and the families felt like they had lost their dignity, and they had been, estranged in the community. And they said, by reading out the names and claiming their innocence publicly as the national cameras roll, you are reinforcing, giving us back our dignity. And so he continued the reading of name after name after name. That was a powerful moment. Another powerful moment, a former military officer, after he made his presentation, relinquished his medal, which is what's here, and on a small table, and the victims and surviving family are sitting on that side. The candle was lit, and he said, I'm giving this medal back because this medal was given to me with blood on it. And it's not mine, and it shouldn't be mine, and it was wrong. And that symbolic gesture of handing that over, very symbolic, realize this is not bringing back the dead, was a moment for him to say the rewards that we were receiving from the system were wrong and immoral, and I don't want anything to do with this. He said these medals are covered in blood. This was at the Yopa public hearing. I mentioned working with the HEP on training. We have a 6-session restorative justice certificate that we've developed, that we started with them. Then the former military that we were working with said, we want that certificate course. We took the former military through it, and then the FARC, their legal team and their FARC leadership, which was the key army militia dissident group, said, we want that training in restorative justice. So we're now running it for the FARC also. So it's been a fantastic process of beginning the conversation and generating new conversation around what restorative justice could look like. Here's some of the team at the HEP that I was privileged to work with, and we were actually looking at a future scenario building exercise here, where we're asking the HEP to come up with scenarios of how they want to see the HEP remembered and what they want to see the HEP to have accomplished by the end of its 15-year tenure. And that was a fascinating moment for them to be thinking about the future and how they can best get there in a restorative way. There's been a great deal of memorialization already happening in Colombia, but I wanted to highlight this one, which is a very creative and painful memorialization. It's a very stark memorial. As you can see, there's nothing on the walls. The floor is made up of metal that's been hammered and brought into tiles and put in there. The significance of that metal is those are former arms that were brought in and melted down and made into the floor. But beyond that, the woman who was the artist, Colombian artist woman who was responsible for this memorial, invited women survivors of war-related sexual violence in when they were building. And she had arranged it so that this metal was still warm enough that it was moldable. And she gave those survivors hammers, tools, whatever they wanted, and they actually beat these crevices. If you come up here closely and look, you can see that it's very, they basically had a physical process of sort of releasing emotional pain of those experiences. And so it's a very stark memorial, but very powerful when you walk in and feel that flooring under your feet. There are many challenges and opportunities before us right now, and so I'll just give a few of those. Political will is everything. The Colombian government, I was not aware of this, in order to try to protect from power abuse, they changed their constitution to a presidential term of 4 years, only one term. So every 4 years you have a change of government. And 4 years in the transitional justice world is not a long time to make a lot of changes. And depending on which side, whether it's the conservative or the other, there's going to be different levels of political commitment to this peace process. So part of the reason this peace process has taken as long as it is, the positive side is that it just takes a long time and is finally being acknowledged. The negative side is 4 years since 2016, we're under a government that did not have a commitment to this political process, to this transitional justice process, and in fact undermined it, and that put things back. We have a current government that has a political will to try to push this through. We don't know what the next term of government will look like. And so there's a real challenge there with the political will to make this happen. Public perceptions are huge. Colombia is a very, very strong Catholic community, and many people say, well, that's why that sort of confession and taking responsibility works. It's a very Christian thing, but I think it's a very human thing. And I think it's not just that. I think there is a tremendous paradigm shift starting to happen in Colombia, but it's an awkward, jagged moment because many say with the Catholic religion comes a very strong emphasis on punishment, and both penitence and punishment. And so the Colombians themselves describe their society as a very punitive society. And so there's a lot of work in public education to make this shift that I was talking about at the beginning towards a more restorative understanding of how do we change harmful behavior. There's lots of questions from the due process and procedural law. I still say, and no pun intended, the jury is still out on whether this is going to work. Can you put punitive law and restorative, procedural law and restorative justice together? We don't know. They're trying. They're doing a valiant effort, in my opinion. The last time I was there, we spoke clearly on what could be due process within restorative justice processes. In other words, how do restorative justice processes protect the rights of everyone involved? You heard some of my colleagues, again, giving those basics of confidentiality, of voluntary nature. No one's forced into these kinds of processes, et cetera, et cetera. Those are due process and procedural law that we need to keep arranging for. We're constantly fighting the litigation creep. What we mean by that is our criminal legal system, our Western criminal legal system, as young as it is in the arc of history, is very entrenched in many societies, including Colombia. And so the tendency of the magistrates who are new to restorative justice to go back to what they know is a constant challenge. So for instance, I'm getting a little bit of detail here, but I will for any of you who are wanting to nerd out on this a little bit. Each of the defendants that are going before the HEP are only allowed one restorative sanction, because if they put a restorative sanction to every one of the cases that that individual may be involved in, it would add up to a 20-year or a life sentence or whatever. And so they're getting one restorative sanction, even though they may be involved in different cases. What has happened is, as the victims have been demanding to know personal stories, the magistrates have been going down the line of command, down to the guys on the ground, the boot soldiers, to hear the stories, and then they're bringing more and more people into the defendant role and charging them. And so this has caused a kickback from FARC, who said we came into a political compromise, a political resolution here, and now you're turning the machinery on us. And so these are the kinds of challenges we're facing. The other one, which was a real challenge, is to get the defense and the prosecution attorneys that appear before the HEP to understand restorative justice clearly too. In one instance, one of the women magistrates at a public hearing actually said, and she's known to be very sympathetic to the victims, but she said publicly in interacting with one of the perpetrators, she said, I don't think you're a psychopath, so how can you help us explain how you got to the place where you could make the decisions to do what you did? The victim, in the midst of all of that and the trauma, felt like the magistrate had taken away her need to think of that person as a monster or a psychopath. And so she was saying, that magistrate is no longer neutral, no longer impartial, and should be recused off the bench on this situation. And when she told her attorney, instead of the attorney who we would trust would begin to help explain some of the give and take and the balance in this between restorative and punishment, instead said, no, that's a violation of your rights, and went ahead and took a lawsuit up on the magistrate. So these are the kinds of things that we're continually having to fight and challenge in the process. One of our biggest challenges will be continuing to link the personal, the structural, recovery, repair, and reparations. I'm convinced, we have this debate all the time, most of my colleagues in the transitional justice field say, we don't know how to deal with the personal. So let's just change the structures and hope for the best. I believe we have to do both. And it's really hard, it's really messy. We have to hear the personal stories. We have to give as much personal attention as we can. And at the same time, we need to change structures that cause the violence to begin with. And this is stretching work and difficult work. And yet, this is what lies before us. In the Colombian situation, the HEP is giving the restorative sanctions, these sort of broad-based repair. The Ministry of Territorial Oversight is supposed to be in coordination with them to make sure that these guys can do their work that they've been sanctioned to. And at the same time, the government is offering the victims individual restitution. Of course, they're not going to be covering all 8 million, and it's not going to be a great deal. But the idea is all three of those parts of the government working together should hopefully link some of the personal with the structural change that's required. And lastly, can we imagine a collective and intergenerational justice and healing in Colombia? We're not sure, but there's a vision for it. And there's a lot of effort and a lot of resources being put to it. And as I said yesterday in my workshop, I would love if we could pass on a justice system that's nonviolent, that allows us to think about different ways in which we can hold each other accountable and heal together. I would like my grandson, who was just born last Friday, first, to be able to grow up in a society that sees justice differently than we currently do. Thank you. Yes, some questions.
First of all, thank you so much, Carl. As per usual, as it tends to be in these presentations for the past 3 years, it's incredible to hear what everybody who has returned has to say. My one question with those that the defendants that elect the restorative justice process, how important is it to ensure their authenticity, and how do you do that if it is an essential part of that process?
Thank you. That's one of the key questions we get. It's the suspicion that we all have that, you know, they're going for the carrot, not the stick, because it's easier, it's softer. But I must say, in interacting with the offenders, perpetrators, those who did the harm, who've done the harm, it's not easy. It's almost easier to go to a trial. I mean, sure, your sentence is going to be reduced, but the path that they're choosing by going this direction is quite heart-wrenching. Their families many of them lose their families over it, lose their position in society over it. They don't have the support of communities. It's a lone path, and then they stand in front of the nation with the cameras rolling and admit to this, and yet many of them say this was the only way we could live with ourselves, with our conscience, and so we needed to do this. So I think the only answer is it's not easy either way, and we're never sure if how authentic they are, and I think authenticity might follow a bit of a spectrum in the processes that they're going through. And so some of them may go into it with some ulterior motives and then find themselves in the middle of it and realize, oh wow, there's trade-offs here. And either I'm going to go with the flow or I'm going to step back out and face the consequences, whichever they are. It's been really interesting to have conversations with the military. You know, they have a lot of sensitivities. It's really hard for them. They've not only been rejected by family and community, but also by the army. They were kicked out of the army. They were thrown out of the army. And they feel like it's basically like dishonorable discharge. And that's something that they're carrying, for the rest of their lives. And so there's a lot of challenge in that, but I think some of the authenticity grows as they go through the process and start doing their own self-work. And hopefully we can accompany them enough in that process. As far as the dissident, also, I think what happens is FARC thought they were going to just tell the truth about what they did, but not have to really feel sorry for it. But they found that as they sit down with the victims and start hearing the stories, they have to start taking the emotional responsibility for what they've done. And they are doing that, though they're very vigilant over keeping their legal rights and so on under protection. And they have grievances. Ever since this started, almost 300 plus community leaders have been assassinated. And these are folks that were former FARC who are doing really incredible community work, and they're being assassinated by we don't know who. But they're saying, hey, government, are you going to provide us enough security so that we don't feel like our lives are under threat because we've gone through this process? So there's a lot of trade-offs and a lot of complications. It's really about what truth and whose truth and how much truth. And so when I talk to folks, and I mentioned this yesterday, we talk in transitional justice, we talk about 4 truths. The forensic truth, which is the factual truth, which we often are after in the courts and the trials. But then there's a personal truth, which was talked about here, the personal story. No one can take that away. That is truth, that's your experience, that's your perspective. And then there's the social political truth, which is what this is all about, which is ideological and cultural and can be manipulated in all different political ways. And then there's this thing called the healing truth. And I have yet to see a PhD on it. I'd like to, if any of you are thinking about that. Because in my experience, a healing truth is a combination of the forensic, of the personal, and of the social and political. But it's not the fullness of all 3 of them. It's a part of all of them. Enough to make meaning that I feel like I can go on in my life. Enough to make meaning that I can say, even though we were killing each other and fighting, there's a place in the future of Colombia for both of us. That's what I think healing truth is. It's never going to be the full truth. It's never going to be fully satisfactory. But it's going to be a decision on the part of a mass of people to say, I can accept this, enough of this to go forward, and go forward with that. Yeah.
I've heard it said that revenge is a form of closure. And I've often heard also that we need severe punishments, we need the death penalty to provide for the victims. So, am I wrong in saying that restorative justice robs victims of their closure?
You are not wrong in saying anything. That is precisely the debate we're having in Colombia. That's precisely the debate. And thank you very much for that conversation. The human rights field and the human rights activism is very clear on this. And they believe that punishment, death penalty, whatever the severity of it, is necessary to deliver justice to the victims. What we do know in working with victims groups in many, many different parts around the world is, first of all, the victim groups are not homogeneous. They're not, a single body. They have many, many different feelings and thoughts about what they need for justice to be satisfied. So we have victims groups that have fully subscribed to restorative processes, saying this is what makes sense to us, and others who are calling for a harder and harder punishment. And so it's a challenge. We do have also research that indicates a number of things, and I'm just going to throw these out. I'm not saying they're right or wrong. I'm saying this is partly what the debate's about. One of those is the logic of violence is really hard to understand. In other words, death penalty is the state-sanctioned killing of someone to make sure the society knows that killing people is wrong. I don't know if that logic is if you're following that. It's a challenging logic. Many people say, well, no, it's different because the state sanctioned it. And if you can sleep at night with that, that's fine. But what we do know is even state-sanctioned violence perpetrates ongoing violence. In other words, the family of the person who experienced the death penalty may not be happy about the loss of their loved one and may take revenge or something into their hands. Now, coming to revenge, revenge is a very human response, and I think we all know it, we all feel it, from the smallest thing to, like, you know, revenge in the workplace by undercutting that whatever that colleague who drives you crazy. But it's also, and we have many ancient cultures that have a very clear revenge cycle. It's life for life, it's eye for eye, it's tooth for tooth. But even in those cultures that are ancient and have been doing this for years, we worked with one of them in Ethiopia, they understand that the violence never stops because there's always someone who has to be avenged. And so one of the most powerful research processes that I saw happen in our country here on the death penalty was down in, I believe, Texas, the state of Texas, and they looked at a longitudinal study of the death penalty cases, and they followed the victims in each of those cases. Now, I'm not sure in all states, but in Texas, the victim's family can be invited to witness the death penalty so that they can, like, actually see with their own eyes that this person was killed. Many of the victims' families, understandably so, refuse to do that. That's a little too traumatizing. But some of them are like, yes, we want to be there. They caused our loved one so much suffering and pain. We want to see them suffering and pain. And so they go. And this research was built on a longitudinal study where they ask a set of questions right after those victims witnessed the death penalty in the case of their loved one. And then 5 years later, they went back to the same family and asked the same set of questions. And these questions were, do you feel revenge has been done? Do you feel like justice has been done? Do you feel like satisfied? Are you emotionally feeling relieved, etc.? And they asked those same questions 5 years later. What they discovered is not only did most of the answers to those questions remain, the trauma remained, but it actually got more complex. Because a number, I'm not sure if all of them, but a good number of the families started to express to the researchers a double trauma. And that was the loss of their loved one and having witnessed the state killing someone else, even though they hated that individual. And what they did to the family, by being there and witnessing it, they had now carrying another kind of trauma that they felt like they couldn't sort of shake. And so what that was saying to many of us in the field is the Hollywood concept of sweet revenge may be only short-term. We may feel that sweet revenge right after the event, because that's what they experienced in that initial set of questions. And then 5 years later, they found out it was much more painful, difficult, and complex than they had expected. Other questions?
I think I have a comment.
Please.
Is state-sanctioned murder, violence, however you want to make it, but the kind that is okay because this person deserved it because they took someone's life, that right there, is that any worse, or does it equate to a prescribed opioid that causes the same problem as a recreational opioid? Well, it's okay, I can take it because it was prescribed. It's okay, it was state sanctioned. But this wasn't, and this was. It was recreational drugs. So you get treated differently. And you just were out there killing somebody, so you get treated differently. What's the difference? And I don't expect you to answer that. I just thought about that when you said,
Sure.
oh, well, they said it's state sanctioned. Well, yeah, it was prescribed, but the outcome was the same.
Yeah, there are tremendous ethical discussions and many, many long ethical dialogue discussions that need to happen. There are so many paradoxes that I carry on a daily basis in this work, but I have to keep holding them as we try to be architects of hope in that process. But I think, who was it that said we have to be able to hold, was it where is he? He's not here. We have to hold, students need to be able to hold paradox. You know, there needs to be a hold that there's no right or wrong answer to every issue. And how do you help folks work with that? So it's a very interesting conversation, and I think we need to take that seriously. It's like equating criminal violence to white-collar crime too. How much, and etc. There's many conversations about the ethics of all of that. Yes.
Do the families have to go? You were saying the families have these sort of private meetings, and then eventually they go and do the event on the stage.
Yeah.
Can either side say we actually don't want to do the public version? Is that an option? Or
Yeah, they don't have to go to the public
They can
hearing
just
if
keep
don't
the
want to
private
at all.
hearing.
Yeah. And they don't have to go to the private hearing. All of it is voluntary. In other words, if they're refusing to have any interaction with the person who did the harm to their family, that's their choice. Then. Yeah.
I was also wondering about families that get what they need privately and actually don't want a public display or don't want everyone to hear the story.
Sure.
If that happens?
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
And also, there's not space or time for everyone to tell their story. So what happened in that hearing is they had chosen particular stories as the victim-survivor community. Certain ones to speak for them and also ones to represent them who were willing to tell their story if they loved them.
I missed who was setting the body count policy. Was it the U.S. with the Colombians I missed who set the body count policy, if it was in cooperation with the U.S. to fight the war on drugs with the Colombian government? Who set the policy?
So the war on drugs was a collaboration, a military collaboration between the U.S. and the Colombian military. I'm not exactly sure where the body count requirement and push came from, and I'm not doing that because I'm trying to worm out. I really don't know, and so I want to be careful not to say something out of turn. I don't know where that original pressure point came, but it went all the way up through the ranks, and we spoke to former military who are now who left the military honorably. They were involved in commanding units where there was killing in combat, but they got calls from some of them talked about getting a call from their generals saying, we need so many bodies, we don't want captives, we don't want prisoners, don't come back with captives and prisoners, we want bodies. And they knew that some of them knew just that was not right, and they weren't going to participate, and they refused. Now they didn't get rewarded, they didn't get medaled, and maybe didn't get promotions. But there were those who said, no, not in my jurisdiction. So we do know that some of them made that decision to resist that violent structure and the protection that it would give them.
Just a comment on restorative justice and death penalties and things like that. There are some Native societies that would, instead of doing the eye for an eye thing where people would hurt each other over and over again, they actually put a stop to it by making the latest offender a relative.
Mm-hmm.
They would give him gifts and say, you've taken a son, you've taken a father, you've taken a grandchild, taken a husband, and we're giving you these things because now you're my son, now you're his nephew, now you're the grandson. And have you seen that? And maybe down through South America, that type of restorative justice, where you're getting someone back as restoration rather than another loss.
Thank you. Fantastic. And yes, I mean, yes, I have seen some of that. I don't know enough about the indigenous communities in Colombia or South America to respond effectively on that. In certain parts of Africa, we experience some of the same kind of indigenous practice. One similar to that is before the community would sanction someone who committed a harm, the whole community would surround them and actually speak what they appreciate about this person, this son, this brother, this husband, and then they would hold them accountable for whatever they did. And it was a way of saying, you're still human. We don't like what you did, and you'll need to repair that. But you're still human, and we want to keep you in the community, and we want to rehumanize you and bring you back into the process. I think this responding in the opposite spirit has a powerful, surprising effect that we in the punitive West rarely understand. But I think we've seen it over and over again in many different places in different ways. And I think it has beautiful symbolism of our interdependence as human beings. In South Africa, there's the Ubuntu, which says, you know, I'm human because I'm in relationship with you. If I failed to be in relationship with another human, I would lose my humanity. So that interdependence is really critical, and what I think we can learn a lot from in our work, and we have. I was most intimately involved with that, with an indigenous process of transitional justice in Sierra Leone after their civil war, where they hybridized and resurrected a very powerful process that's called family talk, and allowed a lot of healing and accountability to go forward in the local communities. And so I'm looking at that as a case where they actually used an indigenous process that affected the national collective healing. And that's a very powerful example of an alternative process, for sure. The indigenous groups in Colombia and the Afro-Colombian all have their own practices that have some restorative justice aspects to them, and they have been asking for more jurisdiction to use those processes in their territories. And part of the agreement is to raise awareness around their processes and give them more jurisdictional control over how they handle harms in their own communities with their own indigenous processes. So we are tracking and hoping that that goes forward effectively. Okay, thank you very much.